there we go. Okay, so my name's Laura Roughan. I'm a consultant clinical psychologist in Southampton CAMS. And today I'm here to talk about oppositional behaviour and demand avoidance. And really I'm talking about children with autism mainly. But I'm sure the strategies would work for other children as well. So the aim today is to talk a bit about oppositional demand avoidant behaviour, demands and why children with autism might avoid them, and to learn some strategies that might be helpful. So first of all, just going to talk a bit about what oppositional behaviour is in autism spectrum disorder. So we talk about oppositional behaviour being refusing to respond to a request or a command made by another person. So children and young people with autism might find it really difficult to do that because of a number of things. So we know that they have differences in the way they process language and understand things. So they might be quite pedantic and repetitive in their speech. So a great example of what is seen as oppositional behaviour might be a child in the school. The teacher says, turn to page 6, we're going to talk about whatever's on that page. And the child goes, you didn't mean page 6, it's page 5. And the teacher says, you know, stop being difficult. They might be very literal in their understanding of language. So somebody says, go over there for 5 minutes and take a break. And they come back after 5 minutes and the teacher says, I didn't say move. And they're like, but it was 5 minutes. So it's that sort of very literal in their understanding. They may find it hard to process a lot of information. So may miss the important bits of the demand that you want them to do, or switch off from it. So therefore looking like they're avoiding it or not doing it. And we know that young people will often have executive functioning problems. So this is problems with planning, organising. So you might say, go upstairs and get ready for school. You get upstairs, they're on their computer because they kind of forgot what you asked. They got distracted. They weren't sure what that involved. And so that's what happened. So they went for something they wanted to do instead. We also know that they have children with autism have differences in their social skills. So they may not pick up that somebody's getting angry from their facial expression. So therefore may not change their response. They may be misinterpreting other people's emotions. So not realizing that somebody is suggesting that they need to do something now because actually they're getting very upset about it. May have difficulty seeing things from another perspective. And so, for example, again, not understanding the impact of their behaviour on others, maybe quite one-sided in their communication. So things are on their term and their agenda. And actually for them, it's very anxiety increasing for somebody to come in and give them a different demand when they're on their routine. And so that can lead to very oppositional behaviour. And then it just may not be interested, and it's really hard to then move them off something that they are interested in to do something less interesting. We've also got inflexible, and I should say rigid behaviours. So rigidity around rules and how these should be followed, difficulties with change, high levels of anxiety. So I think the example I just gave kind of covered some of those. And also just sort of struggling with the kind of sensory world around us. So it's too noisy, it's too busy, and actually that's why I'm going to behave this way because I just can't cope. So I suppose pulling out some of those traits of autism and thinking about oppositional behaviour and why it occurs is really important, because it may be that the young person is not being oppositional on purpose and refusing to do follow a request, but actually they're just really struggling to know what to do. So then we also sometimes, I'm sure people be aware of something called pathological demand avoidant behaviour. And this is really, we don't give separate diagnoses for this, but we kind of understand it as a subset of young people with autism. So again, they still have autism, they still have the key parts of autism, but you might see more of a passive demand avoidance. So this might be where the child is perfect at school, they manage very well, so they're very passive at at kind of doing things, but then at home they're very demand avoidant, highly anxious, and what you might find is that they're not getting aggressive, they're not being difficult, but they're avoiding by coming up with other sort of social excuses. So I need to go to the toilet, I haven't finished this, don't talk to me anymore, those kind of things. So it's quite a passive avoidance. Then we get more active avoidance. So this might be getting aggressive, using threatening language, being quite destructive, putting themselves in danger as a way of avoiding a demand, because as soon as a child does something risky, the demand disappears and the parent or the adult changes their behaviour because they want to keep this child safe. So often that's a good strategy for them to avoid demands. So then just thinking about what a demand is. So demands come with many, many steps. So if I was to say, go and get yourself ready for school, a typical developing child, say 11, may be able to go upstairs, work out what they need to put in their bag, put on their school uniform, find it, all those kind of things, clean their teeth, wash, dress, do their hair, remember to have breakfast, sort out their lunchbox, all those kind of things. But actually, that is so many steps. And actually, with the executive functioning problems and the literal understanding of language, go and get ready for school may not mean much to a child with autism. So sometimes what we need to do is sort of step back and think about what the goal is we're asking them to do and what the demand is and whether that's realistic. So you might, so what I've put here, I've said all this, but there's 10 steps to go and get ready for school. What you might find you need to do is break that down, write them down, have a checklist, or even you might be breaking down one step into 6 steps. So getting ready, getting yourself dressed might involve go to the left drawer to get your socks out. Second drawer down, that's where your trousers are. So it's kind of really unpicking, because that kind of initiative and knowing where to find things, particularly if they change. So you might have an airing cupboard, you might have a ironing pile, you might have a set of drawers that things are in, or a wardrobe. And if they're not where they usually are, then that child's never going to find them. They're not going to think to look in other areas unless it's explicitly pointed out. So if we think of some demands, it may be about how the task is done rather than the outcome you're hoping for. So when we think about the child refusing to do something, what is it that we want them to do? And what's the end result of that? And could it be achieved a different way? So we might want the child to get to school, for example, but they refuse to walk. Actually, if it's so stressful walking and so difficult, and then by the time they get to school, it's an absolute nightmare, we'll get in the car because it's easier. And actually the demand, the goal is still been met, but the demand has changed. And it's about, I think, a lot of the time with children with autism, modifying what the demand is to fit with their needs, but keeping in mind what the goal is so that you still achieve that. So here's a bit more of an example of it. So we might have the goal in the middle, but we've got lots of different things we've got to think about around that. So we've got the child factors. So this might be their motivation, their interest, their ability level, their listening skills, sensory difficulties. So if you take into account all of those things, which I've brushed over before, those are all going to have an impact on how that child performs that goal. We then need to think about the environmental factors. So that's things like noise, distractions, sensory overload, different activities, what the activity is. All those kind of things will get in the way of that child achieving that goal. And then we've got to think about what the task is and whether it's meaningful, whether it's achievable, what the steps are, and how else it could be achieved. So there's a lot of things to think about when you've given that demand or goal. All these other things are going to play into it, and we need to think about how we modify those to reach that goal. So here's an example: completing coursework. We might have a child that's not very interested, that doesn't really understand it, that takes too long writing because their writing's messy, they fidget, they're tired at the end of the day, they prefer to do something else. So that's what's going on for the child. In the environment, they might have noisy siblings, the TV on, all those things are getting in the way of them being able to complete their work. And they have other things that are more motivating around them. So doing their own computer games or playing their own games. And it might be that the task isn't appropriate. So it might be that actually they do have problems with writing and it's too long and it's requiring a lot of writing, or it's got a deadline to it that they can't, you know, that's too soon and it's too much work for them to get done. And we have to consider all those factors for how we complete coursework. So, for example, you might then think, well, actually, it's not really fair that he's doing it when the siblings are playing and we've got the TV on. We need to carve out a time that's just for homework, that's quiet. You might talk to school about things like, could he do it on the computer? Because A, that's more interesting, but B, it takes out the writing element. So you still want him to complete the goal of completing coursework, but you take out some of the elements that are just not, I suppose, they're not able to cope with to be able to achieve that goal. So I think I've said some of this stuff, but we've got things like environmental strategies. So you might think about reducing the noise, reducing the interruptions. You might think about using visual schedules. I think I mentioned earlier, you know, doing a kind of timetable of what was happening. And you can see there's a little picture up there of exactly what I was talking about with which clothes are in which drawer. So you might use those visual prompts so that they know where to find different parts of their school uniform. When you're giving demands, and commands, you need to use really clear language. So this example I've got here is finish what is in your mouth before you put more food in it. So obviously for a young person that just kept shoveling food in their mouth, because other people might say, stop eating like a pig, or eat slower, and they don't really know what that means. So you're being very specific there. Another example is, instead of saying shut up, you might say talk in your quiet voice. So it's giving different ways of explaining what you're doing. You might want to give reminders, warnings, those kind of things. So if you're following, if they're trying to follow something, a demand that you've given, when do you want that achieved? What does it look like? How does it break down? Rather than just, you need to have done this, and then you expecting it to be done by a certain time, but you haven't explicitly said that. So another example is get ready for school. You might be thinking, come on, you've got 10 minutes left, and they don't have a concept of that time. And so they haven't worked out that they only have 10 minutes to do it. You want to reduce the demands and reduce the commands and choose your battles. So sort of picking things that are really important to the family that you want them to do. And then, so for example, you really want them to eat all their dinner, but actually you're picking your battles. They don't have to eat it at the main table with everybody because it's too noisy, too difficult, and they never finish their food. And actually that's probably why. And avoid kind of repeating requests and just talking a lot about it. And always praise compliance. That's sometimes the thing we kind of expect young people to do certain things, but then we forget to praise them, and we focus on the things that they didn't do. And if we're thinking about the tasks, I've talked about some of these already, the task has to be interesting, and particularly, I mean, to any child, it has to be interesting, but it also has to be really interesting to a child with autism. So you try and work out how you can make that task related to their interests. So it could be that the visuals that you stick on things that have a theme of, you know, they're interested in trains, everything's got a train card on it, or they collect train stickers when they've done something right, those kind of things. You want to break down the task to make it easier, because I think there's so much assumption in a task we give. So the one I keep coming back to is, getting ready for school, we just assume people know what that means, and children, young people with autism probably don't. So breaking things down, or even something like pick up your rubbish. I mean, we all know that pick up your rubbish means pick up the wrappers you've just left and the tissue and things like that and put it in the bin. But all you've told them to do is pick it up, and they might not know which bit of rubbish you're talking about. So they might have actually done it very well, picked it up and put it in their pocket or something, and you come back in and go, look at this mess, I told you to pick your rubbish up. Make clear steps. Use timers, they're really good. So giving a sort of set time of when you want something to be done and how you want it to be done. Use visuals, we've talked about, and think about the sensory components. So is there too much sensory input, which then means that they just can't manage it? So for example, trying to do their homework in a busy room. And then these are things we've talked about just to consider, is to think about what things for the child are getting in the way. So if you can see they're already frustrated and getting annoyed with you, that's probably not the time to start putting more demands on them. You want to maybe take, oh, excuse me. Oh, bless me. You want to think about having a break, giving them a bit of time out, and then putting more demands on, because you want to get that emotion regulation back down to somewhere level. Otherwise, if they're already like this, you're just going to flip them to angry or cross or stressed. You also want to think about, I think I've talked quite a bit about this, the sort of planning, organising, how they can do that stuff, because if they've got no planning skills and you've told them to go and get dressed, they've got to sequence that, they've got to find the clothes, they've got to put it on in the right order, they've got to use their motor skills. All those things are really, really quite difficult if you haven't got executive functioning skills. So they might need help, they might need you to put it out on the bed for them in order. And then eventually, over time, you can then take some of that and they find some of it themselves, or they find it and they put it in order before you check the order and then they put it on. So it's you breaking down the tasks again. And you want to think about their social skills, what's important, and whether understanding why something's important. So having a shower and cleaning your teeth might be the worst thing for your child, and they probably don't care whether somebody thinks they smell. But putting that down in a kind of social story of like, we have to be clean because it's, you know, it affects other people if we're not clean, and if we smell, other people won't talk to us. So we have a shower to make ourselves smell nice, and then everybody's happy. So that kind of social story will help them to understand why we have to do things, because from their perspective, they're just like, well, I don't like it, I don't want to. Being flexible, dealing with change, those are really challenging things. So if a young person can't, if you know, a classic one is the computer games. They're on the computer, you've asked them to get off, do something else. They've got their own agenda, I've got to finish this game. You're getting cross because you've given them something to do that they're not doing. And it's thinking about how you can use maybe timers to say your time on the computer comes off now. This is the next thing I'd like you to do. Okay, so that's more thinking about autism and the task and the environment around them, and actually, is the demand appropriate? So that's the first thing that really you have to think about. The next bit is this more demand avoidant. Actually, it doesn't matter what the task is, the young person's going to avoid it. And I suppose a lot that comes into that is anxiety. So my first thing is to think, if this child's avoiding something, it's because they're anxious rather than they're being difficult on purpose. Because often I've seen lots of young people with autism that have like a smirk on their face when they're doing these things, and everybody says they're doing it on purpose. They know it's winding me up. And actually the smirk is a sort of sign of anxiety sometimes. So things that are really helpful is to give choices. So if you've got something you want them to do, like choose what they're having for dinner, or make a decision around dinner, and they avoid it, they can't do it, you give them two choices. So you say, tonight we can have fish fingers and chips, or we can have pizza. Which do we go for? Important to think about the language you use. So for example, let's do some homework is probably going to have a really negative response. Come on, we've got some activities to do now. Sounds much better. This is a maths game. This is a number quiz or a word quiz when you're doing your spelling practice or something. So using language that sounds a bit more appealing is really important, particularly when people are avoidant of demands. Use visuals to help people understand what behaviour is acceptable. For example, you might have things that they can do. So you have pictures of them playing nicely, pictures of them sitting and watching telly. All those things are fine. Pictures of them maybe saying, I don't agree, or I'm not happy about that. But then you can also use sort of visuals such as, I think traffic light systems is a really good one to use, because you have red is clearly a non-negotiable behaviour. Amber is you're getting there, and green is everything's great. And so you could use that visual. You can sit with them and sort of tell them what red behaviours are. And it might just be that you have one, so hitting your brother. If you hit your brother, then there's consequences, and these are you go and sit on the stairs or whatever it is for 5 minutes. But you can then use it to sort of say things like, oh, I can see you might be stepping into amber now. I wonder if you can decide to go back to green. So it's not saying, stop doing that, you need to be doing this, or even just stop doing that. It's using a sort of more visual colour system to get them to do something slightly different. You can use games to get things done. So instead of saying it's time to get dressed and the child refusing and they don't want to do that, make it into a bit of a game. So I bet you can't get dressed before this alarm goes off, or I bet you can't get dressed before me. So trying to make things more interesting for the young person. So here's some examples of things you can say if you've got a very demand avoidant young person. You don't want to be saying you need to do this, or I told you this and you haven't done this, so, and you don't want to be saying no a lot. So these are some of the things you might say instead. So you can have, oh, I need a superhero to help me do this. And if that's their interest, suddenly they're, yes, I can do that. You might say, oh, we need to find out what people want for tea. So I made a tick list. Maybe I can find somebody to take it around. And they're more likely to sort of volunteer for those things. Or we all need to get our feet walking to the door and into the car, that kind of thing. So instead of get in the car now and you get no, it's less directive, I guess. And another one, I don't know if John will choose to show me how clever he is at packing his bag himself. So instead of saying, can you pack your bag for school, please? And then I've written something here that's probably not in a speech bubble. But, so one of the things is to distract from undesirable behaviour by having a different task. So you could say something like, I need to find somebody, I need to find a book on a shelf. I need somebody to help me come and do this. So if you can see behaviour starting to escalate, oh, I need a bit of help with the cooking today. Or, oh, I wonder if somebody can come and do this with me. So distract them by getting them to do different things. So when, I'll just check the time. I think I've just got a couple more slides. So when making demands, you want to be non-confrontational, which is a really different way of thinking things, because a demand is asking somebody to do something, and it's usually quite direct. And particularly with children with autism, we're told to be more clear and more direct. So it's they know exactly what to do. But actually also with these children, this sort of subset of children, we might try to be non-confrontational. So sort of some of those things I was saying a minute ago, like, I wonder if somebody would be able to help me do this, rather than I need you to do this now. Keep the demands simple. So again, it's about breaking it down. So you're not asking them to do a huge thing like get ready for school. You break it down into little subsets like getting dressed, packing a bag, having a breakfast. Give elements of controlled choice when you can. So thinking about, you might have two things that you want them to do. You could say, do you want to tidy your room or do your homework first? So they're both undesirable, they're both awful, but you've given them a choice around which one to do. Allow lots of time, because I think that's the other key thing, is if we go back to thinking about executive functioning skills, they need a lot more time to plan and process and think things through and get things done. So if you've only given 20 minutes to get ready and it's always a stress to leave the house, you might need an hour. And it might feel like, oh, I don't want to get up at that time, I don't want to have to get everybody up, but actually you give yourself the time to do it, it gets done. Another thing quite challenging is to always stay very neutral. So often if there's a time demand, parents get more stressed and are more likely to say, come on, we need to go. And actually, as soon as you do something like that to a demand avoidant child, they're not going to want to do it at all. So it's being really, remember that anxiety, it's being really neutral, really calm. Oh, I wonder if we could get our shoes on now. We're 20 minutes late. Try to use indirect language. So I need somebody to help. I wonder if are quite good ways just to put demands instead. Always build free time into demanding situations. So you might be doing homework, but you've got 2 breaks within your homework, whether you play a game with them or get them to read the story they like or something like that. So it's a real break. So it never gets to that high frustration because they've had a break to calm down in between. And then when trying to stop a behaviour that's happening, try to suggest alternative ways to behave that isn't critical or isn't direct. So you wouldn't say, no, don't hit your brother. You would say, oh, could we walk away? Could we walk away if thingy's annoying you? And then you're not being critical, you're not being direct, but you're giving them an alternative. And when you're saying no to them, you want to try and avoid using the word no, because it's a trigger, but also try and offer alternatives. So if they say, can we go to the park? We go to the park, we go to the park. No, we can't. They're going to get very cross. But you can instead say, oh, it's raining. The park won't be a good idea. Why don't we watch a movie instead? So that kind of thing hopefully will then make it less stressful for them. So I've got 2 more slides, very quick ones. One about common issues, screen time. So I'm sure everybody has problems getting young people off computers. I think it's really important that you set limits around that, because the less limits they have, the more they're just going to play on it. So you might schedule a screen time, use warnings, use timers, egg timer. You've got 5 minutes left. When the sand runs out, it's time to get off. You want to also supervise it because you don't know what they're playing on if you're not aware of what they're doing. We want to encourage other activities. So it might be that you have a bit of reading time first, or you have some social time with a sort of supervised board game, as well as having time on the computers. Always stick to things like a bedtime. So a young person will always try to push the boundary with the screen time. And what you don't want to do is let them push the boundary of bedtime to finish a game. Also, it's a really bad idea for them to be playing on a game just before bedtime, because it stops them being able to release the melatonin that's natural in their brain that helps them feel sleepy. So you want definitely a time to come off a computer and then a more relaxing activity before bed. Use screen time as a reward. So sometimes, these young people, we kind of want to give them screen time because actually it's the time they feel relaxed, it's the time away from social demands. But it's also a really good reward. So what sometimes families do is they have a half an hour scheduled screen time, say, but then that young person can add minutes because they've earned them. So you got ready really well on time for school today and you did everything you needed to, you've earned 5 minutes more on your computer. I see you ate all your dinner, that's another 5 minutes. So you can work out, so you can have a maximum you want them to play on, say an hour, and you can work out different tasks you want them to do to earn extra 5 minutes. So they always get their 30 minutes no matter what they've done or not done, but they can earn extra minutes. So you're never taking something away, you're just adding to it. The other one, last slide, common issues dealing with homework. So I've talked a bit about this already. It's really about understanding the task. So does the child understand? Do you need to talk to school about that? Actually, they come home, they don't know what it is, it's really stressful. Can they communicate it to you, or can it be done a different way? So one of the other things really comes up a lot is home is for home and school is for work. So why would I do homework? Sometimes schools will have a school time in the day that they can do homework, so a homework club, or an hour within their schedule that they can do it at school. So they're still doing it, but it's not at home. Again, can they be flexible, thinking about their additional needs? If they've got fine motor problems, they can't write for long periods, or they find typing difficult, can they do voice recordings of their homework? Can they do something that uses their special interests? Like, can the school think a bit flexibly? Actually, this child will not do homework, but we've got them to do something very similar to what you asked, but it's about something slightly different because it's their interest. Scheduling homework time. So again, you don't want it to just be avoided and avoided and avoided, so it becomes a very late, tired activity for everybody to get stressed about. You just schedule it in so it's there at the same time, and use these rewards to help encourage them. And have a conversation with the young person about when it's best to do it and things. So, conclusion, I'm afraid there's no magic solutions. I think it's important to think about what the goal is, whether there's a different way of achieving it, and how realistic your demands are. And there's a few strategies that might help. The end.
Thank you, Laura. I have questions already. I'm sure everyone else will have questions too. My thought is that I'm just going through the autism assessment process with my youngest. She's 9 and she is massively demand avoidant. I mean, everything you were saying is kind of our life on a daily basis, but that doesn't come up at all in the autism assessment process. I haven't told anyone about that. I'm kind of concerned, I think, a little bit that maybe I've missed an opportunity. We've sort of done the parent part. It's just something, how much does that impact on the autism assessment? I guess I'm just sort of wondering whether I need to go back and say, I forgot to mention. But,
I mean, you totally can. I think one of the problems with the autism assessment pathways, they use very structured tools that ask very structured questions, but there may not be quite enough time for all the other stuff. And I suppose we hope that some of that's in the referral, and obviously, we're working on our referral criterias and processes and things, and we're certainly, I think we've just done a new referral form that will hopefully include all those concerns that parents have and school have before they even get to us. So that would be helpful. I'd advise you just maybe to get in touch with them and say, I just wanted to mention this stuff. I don't think it would have, because we don't diagnose PDA, it wouldn't change the outcome of the autism assessment. You might just, if she gets the diagnosis of autism, you might then think, but I've noticed she's got this pattern of very avoidant behaviour. What would I do differently? And it would be the sort of things I've been talking about today.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. A question we've had from quite a few people is kind of when your teenagers are demand avoidant. A lot of these strategies are great when they're younger, but as they get older and they just become very resistant to any demands being put on them. My son shuts down. He won't communicate. If he has a demand he can't cope with, he just won't speak. He's very passive in that respect. But we've had other families ask about, whenever a demand, even if they try various things, their young person gets very violent, will smash up the house. Or I know there's no easy answers, but is there a different approach for sort of teenagers?
I wouldn't say there is. I think again, it's about what the demand is and how it's put to them. Because with your teenager, if you're saying, come on, you need to do your homework, that's not going to go down well with any teenager, but particularly a sort of avoidant autistic teenager. It's how you can, pick a calm moment and say, look, we know it's important that we do homework. How are we going to solve this problem? How can I encourage you to do your homework? What would work, do you think? So not saying you have to do it, but how are we going to get this goal met in a slightly, and we might have to change the way we do it. So is it that you do it if you did it at school, or is it that if I sit with you, so I've got somebody to ask questions, that would help me do it? Or if I was allowed to do it on the computer, it'd be all right, but I don't want to do the writing. So it's those kind of sort of
do it more as a team in it together. Yeah. That makes sense. Okay.
And I guess there's always an element of oppositional behaviour in teenagers, just regardless of the additional needs, because they're trying to work out how they navigate the world themselves, and they're not going to do it right. And you are still the parent and still putting demands on them, and they don't want to follow those. So there's an element of that anyway, and then it's just made more challenging with the autism as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
I would say most of those strategies will work. It's just drip feeding them in and also involving them in the decision making a bit more, because they are older, and just saying, do you know what, every time I ask you to do something and we end up in this huge thing, none of us like that, what could we do instead? How are we going to do it so that, because sometimes I am going to ask you to do things, and sometimes we need you to do things, and maybe even making a list of all the things you ask and choosing 2 or 3 or something. Okay, I won't ask you to do any of those other things, but these are really important. And getting them, the young person, to agree, okay, if you're only asking me about those ones, that's okay, but I can't cope with all these demands.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think coping and resilience plans are really useful with some of the things that they get really overwhelmed with as well. We certainly found them to be very helpful. Thank you. Right, we'll take some questions from other people. Monica has put in the chat, how do you convince a young person who's 7 to add a task to their routine which they say they don't do due to rigid thinking? So for example, refuses to brush teeth in the morning. Oh yes. So how do we do that when you want them to do something on top of what they normally do?
Yeah, so I suppose with just picking on something like brushing teeth, it's also doing maybe a social story to understand why you have to brush your teeth. So there's lots of reasons we have to brush our teeth. We don't want them to fall out. We don't want our breath to smell. So understanding some of those things, all right, might really help. The other thing, sort of adding something onto the routine, there may have to be a bit of negotiation around that, or a bit of rewards. So if you've got a 5-step routine already, and then you're like, so now I'm ready to add it in step number 6, and they're like, no, this is my routine. It's like, well, sometimes we have to add things to our routine because you're getting to be a big boy now, and you can do this thing for yourself. So if you do this, that means you get a bit more grown-up time on Xbox or something. So rewarding them for that change, because that's a big change for them. It may to us feel like, oh, I'm just adding another 5-minute task, but actually it's a big change to their routine, and it's anxiety provoking. So it's how can we encourage them to manage that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. Someone else has asked, what support should an extremely demand avoidance child with a diagnosis of PDA get at school? My son is about to start school and I see both passive and active demand avoidance in him. At the moment, I'm told the school want to see how he presents and then take action, which is no good.
And that's a tricky one in terms of providing an exact answer to. So what I can tell you is that schools would, exactly like you say, they want to find out a little bit more about the young person, and they will find out pretty quickly if he can't cope in sort of doing normal things with no additional support. School will be thinking from day one about reasonable adjustments that they can make to support that young person. So, for example, that might include having a TA to go and meet them because they're struggling to come to the classroom, or having a wobbly cushion because they can't sit still on the carpet, having somebody to remind them of the instructions at the beginning of a task. So those are kind of reasonable adjustments they would make, offering some social skills work, which would be part of their needs because of their diagnosis. If school, after say a term, are saying we're having lots of challenges, they would be collecting information on what those challenges are and writing a kind of some sort of report or documenting what support they're putting in place, because they will have resources within the classroom to offer him some one-to-one support, and then they will just document, we're already doing all these things and actually we still need more support. And when they get to the point of going, yes, we need more support, they might apply for an education health care plan, which is the EHCP. And at that point, they then get more funding to put in that support while the plan's being thought about and done. Now, before that point, they might be saying, actually, we've put in reasonable adjustments. He's coping fine. He's doing really well. So we don't need to go down that route. That doesn't mean that he might not go down that route in 5 years' time or 2 years' time. But it's really, school do need to get to know him a little bit and put in their reasonable adjustments and see if those help.
Yeah.
So every autistic child or every PDA child is their own child, their own personality. They've got their own needs, their own strengths. So it's really hard to say this is what they would all need.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, someone else has said, my children don't see the differences between them as children and us as adults. For example, my daughter will try and set boundaries with me, copying my mannerisms and language. She's 16 and has always been like that ever since she was tiny. Any tips?
That's a difficult one. That's again about understanding the autism and them understanding society, I guess, because it's a very socially led understanding. So we understand who's an adult, the hierarchy of work, the hierarchy of school, all those kind of things. But an autistic child may not get that because they're not thinking about other people's perspectives. They're not necessarily aware that there's that hierarchy at home. So you listen to the adult and the child does what the adult says. So you can work on sort of explaining that to them, particularly I'd say if they're 16, it might be okay at home, but it's not going to be okay in the workplace or in college and things like that. So they need to learn how to follow some of that societal hierarchy that we just all kind of know about. So teaching them, so rather than telling them they're doing it wrong, it would be thinking about teaching them how they might respond to somebody that they've just met at college, like a peer, versus when they're in an interview with the college head teacher, and what it would be like when they start a job, who they can answer back to and who they really can't answer back to. So it is really common, and I think it's just that they don't have that understanding of kind of where other people sit and where they sit in relation to that. So that's one part. In terms of tips, I'm sure she's been doing it for all her life. You've probably got more tips than me for other parents. But I guess, again, it's just working out, it's reminding them of the social skills. Oh, thank you for your advice, but I'm not going to take it. Or, oh, you're being very bossy today. Just pointing out some of the things they're doing and why it's maybe upsetting you or you find it difficult. Because I think we have to assume that they don't understand that they're doing something wrong. And then explaining to them is probably the best approach.
Yeah. All right, thank you. Does anyone else have any more questions? Oh, here we go. Here's one popped up. That's good timing. Is there any kind of therapy a very demand avoidant or anxious child can have?
I wouldn't advise, you might have noticed that everything I spoke about today was really putting it on you as parents to do. And I probably wouldn't advise that there was a particular therapy, because actually, if we think about a child with autism, they're managing a lot of anxiety, we know, but the anxiety is very much about the environment and the social elements of the environment. So, for example, you wouldn't give a young person therapy because they find noise distressing. You would think about how can they manage that noise. So maybe it's, I met a girl the other day who's like, oh, it's okay, when I walk down the corridors, I've got my little earplugs in, so I can't hear as much noise. So I was like, oh, brilliant. So nobody knows she's wearing them. Other children might wear ear defenders. So you try and think of alternatives in the environment or ways to fix the environment to make them feel less anxious. And that's the best approach. Now, when we're talking about older children, there is an element of them needing to, so again, the demand avoidant, there's no therapy. It's really about behavioural techniques that the parents are using. In terms of anxiety as a kind of separate part of autism. So when we're talking about noise, we're thinking, well, that's part of your autism, and actually we need to modify the environment around you. But we know that lots of young people with autism are more likely to have coexisting mental health problems. So anxiety can be a separate mental health problem. And then, yes, there's therapy for that. So we might be thinking about a young person who's developed some OCD traits. So they've started checking a lot, they're hand washing all the time. That's a separate condition to their autism. It's definitely impacted by their autism, but they would be able to access a CAM service and get some CBT for OCD. And the best way of doing that would be to modify it to also take into account the autism. So giving them slightly different techniques and things to use. Similarly, you might have a child that has also experienced some trauma. For example, they had a car accident, they keep thinking about the car accident, they keep dreaming about it, they're not sleeping very well. We would be able to offer therapy for that trauma. But there isn't a particular therapy for demand avoidant autistic behaviour, if that makes sense.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. Yeah, that person, I'm trying not to use names just for anonymity, that person's come back and said that makes sense, is managing the environment with demands. I was thinking about the anxiety. I see my little one's starting to be a little OCD with some things already.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's also a difference, and we as clinicians get quite confused as well. I'm often meeting young people that I've been told to have OCD, and then when I meet them, I'm like, oh, actually, I think this is some of their autistic behaviour. So there's everybody has some OCD traits. That's fairly normal. I think we've all seen a bit of obsessive hand washing because of COVID and things. Just in general, we get more of an ick and need to wash our hands, or I do. And I certainly didn't have that before COVID. But in an autistic child, they will have routines and they will have things that they like to do that appear like OCD to us, but actually the important bit is whether they also have the kind of thinking around it. So if they're checking everything and they're lining it all up and put it in order, and they can't cope until it's like that, is that because of an underlying fear of something terrible happening or somebody dying? So to prevent that thought of somebody dying, they have to have everything in order. That's OCD, and that's definitely a different thing that can be treatable in CAMHS. But if it's just they like things in order and they need it in order because it helps them to manage their world, that's autism. That makes sense.
Yeah, that does. Thank you. Okay, next question is, our son is compliant at school but seeks total control at home. Does he need to let off steam when he gets home because he was compliant at school, or is he just enjoying being rude and oppositional to adults at home because we tolerate it? Is he acting out on us, what he'd like to say and do to the teachers all day?
I think the first bit, the needing to let off steam, we often see when you're in a place that you feel safe or with people that you trust, you're more likely to let off steam. So this is why it happens that they keep it all together at school and then suddenly just fall apart at home. It would be just the way you've written it. I wonder about the reactions. So you said that he gets away with it at home, or is it that he gets a reaction from somebody? What's the consequence of the behaviours? So sometimes you might have somebody, a little boy, I'm just picking a little boy just while I talk, who will be calling you names because you then respond. And actually, what was he doing before? Well, he was playing quietly and you were busy doing something else. So he didn't get any kind of direct attention from you. And he's learned that by calling you lots of names, you then give him some attention. Negative, probably, by saying, don't call me that. But that kind of pattern might play out at times. So then you want to turn it around and realize when he's playing nicely that you really need to praise that behavior and be going, oh, aren't you doing really well? Can I come and play with you? To give him some positive attention. And then when he starts calling you names, you completely ignore it and it will disappear. So that's one way of managing it. Don't know if I answered the question. But I think also there's an element of he's held it together all day and he probably just needs to let it all out.
Yeah, absolutely. Another comment rather than a question, it's just I think there should be good support for parents with demand avoidant children, because parenting these children can be exhausting and takes a lot of cognitive energy. Maybe offering CBT for parents to manage the stresses, plus peer support groups, including Remind, thank you, and its new R&R group, which was formerly the NAP course. I think that's really important. It's something we're sort of moving towards more and more, is looking after, well, that's what Reminds does really, is looking after those parents and carers about, you know, thinking about the stresses and strains that they're under. But I like the idea of a group, you know, focused on demand avoidant, and I'm going to be mulling that over now, thinking about what
and I'd say Reminds are brilliant for all that stuff. And also, if you are feeling really overwhelmed and really stressed, there is access for parents as an adult, if that makes sense. So you can access your own adult mental health service in your own right, because you are coping with so much stress of managing your child. So just thinking about if you're feeling really stressed and really anxious about it, the one first place that comes to mind is the Steps to Wellbeing service, which is a CBT service for adults in the city. And it would offer you a space to go and think about those, to learn strategies to manage your own stress. And I think you can either go to the GP or self-refer, I expect.
You can self-refer now. Yeah, and we've opened up our adults mental health clinic that we run once a month to parents as well. So it's not just seeking advice for your young person, it's you can go there and talk to one of the adult mental health team about your own mental health and get some advice and sort of about where to go and what to do next. So there is stuff, but definitely more.
Yeah. And I know we're running out of time today, but what I think is slightly lost on Zoom, that is the the spontaneous bit where parents can actually give support to other parents.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
used to run these groups, do these kind of topic groups in my last job. And actually, sometimes I'd be like thinking, oh, what can I say? And in that time, somebody's answered the question for me that's had a similar experience.
Yes, that's one of the things we miss about the face-to-face sort of speaking. It can be really great to have the video to be able to share, but it's really nice when everyone can sort of pitch in together. And I guess that's sort of part of what we do with Reminds when we have the meet-up groups or the catch-up groups. It's that opportunity to chat about what's going on and get some advice from each other, which has been really useful.
Got a forum for that, just a different.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I would have. Next time I do one of these, I'd love to hear what other. I might just say, who has an idea?
Yeah, no, completely. Yeah, there's so much knowledge within, all our families. It's amazing. Okay, well, I don't think I have any more questions. What I do have, this is something I'm trying, is to I'm going to launch for those people that have attended a really quick poll. I don't know if it's going to work. It doesn't always work. It's really useful just to know if it was a helpful session. It's, we're quite often asked by CAMS as well for a bit of feedback. So it's just really helpful if I can have that. And what I've got to do is remember not to finish the Zoom before I get all the data from it. But thank you ever so much, Laura. It's been really useful as ever. Just lots to go away and think about, I think. And thank you for everyone for coming along and contributing today. Have a great bank holiday weekend.
Yes, you too. And I'll see you all again soon.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.